Um, Good morning. Thank you, Chairman, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. I find myself rather pleased to be here today, not necessarily because of what I'm going to say, but because the last public speech I made was in Stormont, and it seems to me to be a nice symmetry that after Stormont before Christmas, one should speak in Dublin Castle after Christmas.
Hear, hear.
It may be the only pleasant thing I have to say today, but at least there's one. I'm not altogether sure how this... next. Very good. A lot of what I say, I think, will probably give substance to what the Minister has just said, because my interest is to lay out the scene from the viewpoint of what's been agreed and what's to be agreed in Europe, rather than to enter the debate about what Ireland does. I think that's a problem and an issue to be addressed by Ireland very much in cooperation with the Commission and the other member states, but nevertheless to be done in that way. So a few basics which don't need any length. Atmospheric CO2 is up 30% since the beginning of the industrial era. The historic contributions, fossil fuels, and land use and cultivation, 60% estimated for fossil fuels, 40% for cultivation. Who contributes to the emissions? 90% of the emissions from, let's say, the industrial world come from energy and industry, so it's fossil fuel essentially, and 80% or thereabouts come from land use change in other parts of the world. And it's quite clear, it needs to be said over and over again, that everybody has to be on board if we're to make progress on this overwhelming issue. The Minister has explained a little bit of this, but let me put it in a more structured way. The European approach to climate change has been based on three aspects, each one of them of immense importance. What has been done up to December last, getting our house in order, setting the targets for 2020. That and the Poznan conference some weeks ago, and the work that my colleagues will be doing and many people here will be doing for this year, is preparing for the next round of Kyoto, whatever it's going to be called, but hopefully an agreement in Copenhagen at the end of 2009. And the third part is every bit as important as the first two parts, and that's to say, putting together an adaptation to the reality of climate change. We can't ignore it. So getting our house in order, the December package, three elements of which I think one should be highlighted as the key, and that's reducing emissions by 20% compared to 1990. And that's got the two parts. The Minister explained it. Let me go a little further. 21% reduction in the emissions trading scheme, for those in the emissions trading scheme, and individual member state targets for the non-ETS, which is the area, I guess, of greatest discussion today. An increase in the share of renewables to 20%, and the Minister has indicated a very demanding target to be achieved by Ireland in relation to non-transport, and an increase in energy efficiency by 20%. So a very brief look at the ETS. I think the essentials are that the ETS is a very demanding system that's there. First of all, it's European rather than individual member state. Secondly, in essence, it deals with the large industry and large plants. There is a move, in essence, from voluntary to an auctioning approach, and the sector has to achieve a 21% decrease in greenhouse gas emissions between 2005 and 2020, or rather by 2020, based on 2005. There's an expanded scope insofar as industrial sectors are concerned, and there's an expansion in gases contained for those sectors. The revenues which should be substantial, can be used in several ways that I just indicate, as the Minister has indicated, in relation to forestry and in relation to this overwhelming problem of global deforestation, which is a lot more complex than simply the cutting down of trees. It deals with almost every human problem. The most important one then, of course, is the effort sharing, the decision of the Member States on the efforts of the Member States to reduce greenhouse gases to meet the reduction commitment. And this is where we have an overall different set of targets for each Member States, depending on, for instance, GDP, where some Member States have very, very low targets and some Member States have very high targets, and that has all been decided and settled upon within the legal text, so it's not an issue for debate, but that's where the Irish 20% figure goes. Flexibilities built into that system, which are very important, of course, insofar as achieving the targets that are set, and those flexibilities will, I'm sure, be part of your debate today. Land use change and forestry are not included in this system due to the lack of harmonised rules for monitoring and accounting emissions and sequestrations. So they're not there at the moment. That doesn't mean that it won't happen, it means that they're not there at the moment. And there is, of course, provision, as there is under ETS, provision in relation to the changes that may be necessary in the event of a stricter international agreement. And that, if you read the legal text, and the legal texts at the moment, I don't think they're published in the official journal yet, but the version that left the Council and the Parliament has 250 pages. It's not my intention to go through those 250 pages, but what the point I make in relation to that is that there are a whole lot of little bits and pieces that need to be read and understood as you develop your approaches to achieving the targets. The very important element of the December package relates to the promotion and the use of energy from renewables. Mandatory Member State targets for overall share of energy from renewables to achieve the 20%. So this is a significant part of the package. Sustainability criteria for biofuels and other bioliquids. And I think what the Minister has just said, I don't believe there was any part of the whole package that involved so much debate as establishment of sustainability criteria for biofuels. And it is an area where there will be need always for a great deal of scientific knowledge and intellectual honesty in order to ensure that that is indeed what we do. The atmosphere is not quite like your opponent in a football pitch. The atmosphere is completely neutral. And if we increase greenhouse gas emissions by virtue of a sleight of hand, the atmosphere actually doesn't particularly care if the atmosphere has any feeling at all. It just affects the total amount that's in the air and therefore affects the speed of climate change. We have to yet develop sustainability criteria for biomass. 10% of the energy consumption in transport has to be from renewable sources, not only biofuels, and clearly there is a whole piece of work going on about how to make second generation part of that achievement, and we will be looking at that in the course of the next several years. Second generation will count as double insofar as achieving that target, and biofuels from waste and residues also. That's all part of a stimulus to try to bring those sectors into a better situation. And this will be based on national plans. Other elements of the package which I think I put on the table not because they're of particular relevance to you today, but because they show the extent and the amount of reflection that has been done by Member States, by the Commission and by many others in putting this package together. A directive on the geological storage of carbon dioxide, which sets about a legal framework to manage environmental risks and liability issues, essentially. That's important if indeed this technology becomes successful, that we don't have regrets in the future as to the way it operates. And the directive on emission standards for new passenger cars. Again, something not immediately relevant, but showing the package of measures that pushes in the direction of helping to achieve the overall 20% target. And that's not a small demand. And the motor sector will, of course, have been lobbying to slow down that process. A reduction to 120 grams of carbon dioxide per kilometre for the fleet by 2015, a much debated date, and that includes a contribution for biofuels. I'm always amused when I see information about carbon dioxide emissions on car advertisements. They're generally tucked down at the corner as if this was something to be proud of. In fact, we have to go to zero emissions, or as near to zero emissions as possible in a not so long period. That's a target eventually to be achieved if we are to achieve the 80% reduction that the scientists tell us we need to achieve in a reasonable period. And a longer term target of 95 kilos, of 95 grams. The package in agriculture is probably of relevance, but it only sets the scene for other speakers. Agriculture in the EU is responsible for 10% of greenhouse gas emissions, and that doesn't include land use change and forestry, nor does it include energy use in agriculture. Agriculture with other sectors accounts, so buildings, waste and so on, accounts for about 60% of total EU greenhouse gas emissions. So we cannot concentrate on just the big operators of the big plants. We have to deal with the entire package. Reductions are needed for these sectors, but the approach, and this is why this speech is a standalone speech to help you understand, but your debate has largely to be internal. The approaches to be taken rest with the member states, supported, of course, through community policy. Flexibility, I have mentioned, and I'm sure flexibility will be mentioned in the future, but that allows for some leeway, and we'll see how that develops. Agriculture is not within the ETS. The ETS essentially is designed for major combustion plants and so on. We have 10 million farms in Europe. Putting farmers into the ETS would lead to an enormous amount of bureaucracy and a very difficult situation insofar as the operation of that system would be concerned. I think we'd end up reducing fertilizer use by X or cow numbers by 0.0 something, so it's not there. As the Minister indicated, the impact on the agricultural sector, including carbon leakage, will be assessed after the international agreement, and that's written into the legal texts. Land use change is not included in the European package, and remember, we're talking about a European package, getting our house in order. But there is agreement in principle that it should contribute to the EU's reduction commitment, both in terms of the 20% and the 30%, which is the EU offer for Copenhagen. But in all that, and I say this without without wanting to undermine it, there is a tremendous need for proper measurement, for accurate measurement, and for ensuring that there is a permanence in the emission reductions achieved in land use change and forestry. I've dealt with the first part, and Chairman, I hope I still have 5 minutes or so. Second part, sorry?
5 minutes left.
Very good. Second part deals with climate diplomacy. What are we doing now in terms of getting ready for Copenhagen. First of all, it's quite clear that we were aiming towards the period post-2012 to 2020. Secondly, we're 14% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, and all countries need to be on board, and that's the same point again. Thirdly, our offer is 30%, and the agreement, as I indicated in some of the slides but didn't go into it in detail, will require adjustment of the EU package. That's quite clear. All sectors have to contribute, and that's the difference from the present situation, and that would imply that land use change and forestry would come in. And there's the issue of supporting developing countries to advance while limiting their emissions, and there's the huge issue on deforestation. Deforestation, the Minister indicated 18% or so of greenhouse gas emissions, so it has to be there. The last couple of slides deal with adapting to climate change. Adaptation is recognised by the UNFCCC now, and it has to be complementary to mitigation. We need, over the same time as we're preparing to respect all our obligations, we also need to build an adaptation framework. We need to improve resilience. We need to reduce vulnerability. And we need, in that context, to think about health, food security, and so on. The Commission will bring out a communication on climate change adaptation this year. Of course, it will be complementary to much of the work that's going on in individual member states. The kind of principles for action will be priority for measures, good for mitigation and good for adaptation. No regrets. The precautionary principle, and the precautionary principle seemed to me to have its best illustration in the floods of last summer during the month of August. Solidarity. There's no use in the Netherlands building up a whole heap of dikes if it floods Belgium, particularly if it floods Belgium in my case. And sustainability of land use practice, especially for soil organic matter. We have in Ireland a wonderful level of soil organic matter, which will be hugely beneficial over the long period, both in terms of slowing down the release of water, and in the case of member states with very low carbon, which is many member states, build up of that carbon in order to slow down or to hold on to water. CAP and climate change. What can I say generally about it? First of all, the recent reforms of 2003, 2008 have removed the link between support and production, so there's no driver within the CAP to increase production and therefore have some problems. Cross-compliance, and I suppose I can't very well come to Ireland without mentioning the Nitrates Directive implementation, requires better management on the farm, better efficiency on the farm, and Jerry Boyle made the exact same point without using the words, and therefore can contribute to reducing greenhouse gas losses. Rural development strategies and programs for 2007-2013, we deliberately, member states and the Commission, placed emphasis on the protection of water, on biodiversity protection, and on climate change mitigation and adaptation. We deliberately put that into the period 2007-2013, and in the reform of just 3 or 4 weeks ago, we again targeted that money going into rural development will again have emphasis in relation to biodiversity protection, water protection, climate change, adaptation and mitigation, as well as energy. And that was precisely done as part of the backup to the need to support member states as they address climate change realities. Finally, some concluding remarks. Another speaker would make different concluding remarks. I make mine. All sectors face huge challenges to contribute to mitigate climate change. Agriculture, in my view, not alone faces that, but it also faces huge adaptation challenges, and we cannot ignore those while we're dealing with mitigation. A low-carbon economy has to be achieved if we're serious about climate change, and that's a deep philosophical question. If we're serious about climate change, of course we may say, well, we'll leave it to the next generation, that's their problem. if we're serious, we have to change to a low-carbon economy. The 2008 EU package is a step, and the post-Kyoto agreement, if that's what it's called, is another major step. But they are not an end. This process will go on throughout the lives of everybody here. There has to be a huge emphasis on increased energy efficiency and innovation in energy technology. That offers opportunities, but it offers opportunities not just in agriculture, it offers opportunities that I always look up at the sun and say to myself, when I see the figures of the World Petroleum organizations, when they show this much as the amount of petroleum in the world, and basically the size of the room as the energy that you can get from the sun. And that's a huge area where solar, where research will be needed over time and where the community will, of course, support. And there's much work. Let's be positive on this. There's much work going on, particularly in the Mediterranean countries, to get a huge amount of our energy from solar within a relatively short period. And I'm sure the Minister will like my last point. Climate change is not the only environmental problem. Water, biodiversity, and natural resources are all under threat. And climate change is increasing the pressure on each one of those. So as we deal, even within the rules, we also have to think of dealing with those other issues which are getting worse by the day. Thank you.